I thought it was just an ordinary night in a quiet hotel room. But I was so wrong. His voice, calm and inviting, whispered my name, sending shivers down my spine. He wasn't just the stepson I thought I knew. In that moment, something shifted. When his hand brushed against mine, I froze. My heart raced as I realized we were about to cross a line that would change everything forever. I never thought my life would lead me to such a complicated place. I was married to a man who had given me everything: security, comfort, and a sense of belonging. But deep inside, I often felt like an outsider in my own home. My husband was kind and caring, but his work kept him miles away, both physically and emotionally. I tried to be the perfect wife, putting on a smile even when the silence between us grew louder. Then there was Ethan, my husband's son from his previous marriage. Ethan was polite, charming, and carried himself with a confidence that belied his young age. We had always maintained a cordial relationship, one that balanced between formality and familiarity. But something shifted in recent months. I started noticing small things: how his gaze lingered a moment too long, how his laughter felt warmer when we were alone. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. After all, I was his stepmother, and he was just trying to bond with me. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. His compliments felt more personal, his jokes carried a hint of flirtation, and I began to feel something I couldn't explain. It scared me. How could I, a married woman, even entertain these thoughts? Life in our home was a routine of predictable monotony. My husband and I barely spoke about anything beyond the practicalities of our lives. Ethan, however, was different. He had this energy, a way of making even the mundane feel exciting. When my husband traveled for work, Ethan and I spent more time together, and those moments became a dangerous mix of comfort and temptation. I told myself I was imagining things. I tried to avoid being alone with him, to keep our relationship as it had always been. But it felt like we were both drawn to something unspoken, something forbidden. Little did I know, the cracks in my perfectly constructed life were about to widen, and everything I thought I knew about myself and my family would soon come crashing down. It started with small moments, little things that seemed insignificant at first, but slowly grew impossible to ignore. Ethan's casual remarks began to carry a weight they hadn't before. "You look really beautiful today," he said one evening, his voice steady and his eyes locked on mine. I brushed it off with a nervous laugh, but deep inside something stirred. Was I imagining the way his tone softened when he spoke to me, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long? My husband's frequent business trips left the house feeling hollow, a silence that crept into my heart. Ethan began spending more time at home, offering to help with chores or sit with me during dinner. "It's too quiet around here," he'd say, and I'd nod, grateful for the company but uneasy about the undercurrent of tension that seemed to accompany it. Then there were the phone calls. I started noticing Ethan would lower his voice when he answered his phone around me, stepping out of the room with a quick excuse. Once, I caught a glimpse of his screen, and my name appeared in the middle of a text he was typing, then quickly deleted. My stomach churned, a mix of fear and curiosity I couldn't shake. I tried to maintain my distance, to focus on my marriage, and remind myself of the boundaries I had vowed to uphold. But the more I tried, the more Ethan seemed to close the gap. One evening, as we sat watching a movie, his arm brushed against mine. It was a fleeting touch, but it left my skin burning. I told myself it was accidental, but his slight smile told me otherwise. Things escalated when I found myself alone in the kitchen with him late one night. The house was dark and quiet, and I was cleaning up after dinner. Ethan walked in, his footsteps soft against the tiles. "You should let me do that," he said, reaching for the dish I was washing. His hand brushed mine, and I froze. His eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air was heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. I pulled my hand away and turned back to the sink, my heart pounding in my chest. "Good night, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment longer before quietly leaving the room. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. Was I imagining things? Or was there truly something shifting between us? The boundaries that had once felt so solid now seemed fragile, like they could crumble with the slightest touch. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into innocent moments. But deep down I knew the truth. Ethan wasn't just a boy trying to get closer to his stepmother. There was something else, something forbidden, that neither of us seemed able to ignore. And despite every effort to push it away, I could feel it growing stronger, threatening to unravel the life I had so carefully built. The days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty and guilt. Despite my best efforts to keep things normal, the tension between Ethan and I grew unbearable. There were moments when I could feel his presence in the room, his eyes on me when I least expected it, his smile just a little too knowing. I told myself I had to stay strong, to keep things in check. But I knew deep down that the lines we had once maintained were already beginning to blur. It happened on a quiet afternoon. My husband had just left for another week-long business trip, leaving the house feeling emptier than ever. Ethan had stayed behind, claiming he needed to finish some work for school. As usual, he kept me company in the kitchen, casually chatting as I prepared dinner. But that evening was different. The air felt thick, as if something unspoken was hanging between us, just waiting to be acknowledged. As I reached for a dish on the top shelf, my hand brushed against his. For a brief moment, I thought I might pull away, but instead I lingered just for a second too long. His fingers curled around mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. My heart raced, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. The silence between us stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "Aunt Aisha," he said, his tone low and intimate. I turned to face him, my breath shallow. His eyes held mine, and in that moment, I couldn't look away. There was something in them, something dark, something raw, that made my pulse quicken. "I never wanted to be just your stepson," he continued, his words soft but laced with an undeniable intensity. "Do you understand?" I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to deny it all, to push him away and remind myself that this was wrong, that we could never cross that line. But another part of me, the part one had buried deep inside, was waking up, urging me to do something that felt dangerous, thrilling even. Before I could respond, Ethan took a step closer, his breath warm against my skin. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The touch sent a wave of heat through me, and my body betrayed me, leaning into him just slightly. I closed my eyes, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted, what I craved. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, "You don't have to say anything. I can feel it too." His words, his touch were intoxicating. I knew I should pull away, that this was wrong, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I had spent so long burying my desires, pretending that everything was fine, but in that moment, I realized how much I had wanted this. My hands trembled as I reached for him, my fingers brushing against his chest. His eyes closed as he exhaled softly, and before I could stop myself, I kissed him. It was a kiss that was desperate and hungry, a kiss that spoke of years of unspoken longing. His lips were warm, gentle at first, but then more demanding, pulling me closer as if he knew this moment was fleeting, and we had to make it last. For a long time we kissed, neither of us willing to break the connection. My heart was pounding in my chest, a fierce rhythm that matched the heat building between us. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, that this could destroy everything I had built. But there was another part of me, a part one couldn't ignore, that told me to keep going, to let go of all the restraint I had so carefully cultivated. When we finally broke apart, breathless and disoriented, Ethan's eyes were filled with something I couldn't place. "Now what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I wanted to say something, to stop everything before it went any further, but I couldn't. The temptation was too great, and the pull between us was undeniable. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaky, unsure of what to do next. But I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want to face the consequences of our actions, not yet. The night felt like it lasted forever. We didn't speak much after that, each of us caught in our own tangled thoughts. I knew what we had done was a betrayal, that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But in that moment I didn't care. The desire, the need, felt too strong to resist. And as the hours passed, I realized something. I wasn't the woman I had once thought I was. I was someone else entirely, someone who had made a choice, for better or worse. When the morning came, everything felt different. The guilt weighed heavily on my chest, but there was also something else. A part of me was scared, terrified of what we had done, but another part of me was still yearning for more. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the room and bringing with it the stark reality of what had happened the night before. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart heavy and my thoughts racing. Ethan was still asleep, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of his breath. I couldn't look at him without feeling the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. I got up quietly, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet as I moved to the window. The city outside was alive, buzzing with activity, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded in my world. My husband's voice echoed in my mind, his laughter, his trust. It was all too much. I felt a lump in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't afford to break down now. Morning, Ethan's voice startled me, and I turned to see him sitting up, his eyes warm but filled with something darker. Satisfaction, perhaps? Or was it anticipation? I couldn't tell. I forced a weak smile, unable to meet his gaze. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan frowned, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "About last night." I nodded, my hands clutching the edge of the windowsill. "It was a mistake, Ethan. This can't happen again." He stood and crossed the room in a few strides, stopping just inches from me. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt my resolve weakening. "A mistake," he repeated, his tone almost incredulous. "You didn't feel like it was a mistake last night." My cheeks burned, and I turned away, trying to compose myself. "It doesn't matter what I felt. It was wrong. I'm married to your father." Ethan scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're only saying that because you're scared. Don't pretend this wasn't real." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I rushed to grab it, grateful for the distraction, but the sight of my husband's name on the screen made my stomach twist. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Ethan watched me, his expression unreadable. "Are you going to tell him?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with challenge. I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Of course not. How could I?" The room fell into silence, the tension between us palpable. I answered the call, forcing a cheerful tone as I spoke to my husband, pretending everything was normal. But even as I reassured him that I was fine, my heart was pounding, and I felt Ethan's eyes on me the entire time. When the call ended, I set the phone down and turned to face him. "Ethan, we need to move on. This has to stop." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, but he simply nodded. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, though his tone suggested otherwise. I thought the worst was over, that I could bury the night and move on as if nothing had happened. But life had other plans. Later that day, my husband called again, his voice strained and serious. "Aisha, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his words sending a chill down my spine. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm on my way home," he said. "There's been a delay in negotiations, and I thought I'd surprise you." My heart stopped. He was coming home, and I had no idea how I was going to face him. "That's great," I managed to say, my mind racing. "When will you be here?" "In a few hours," he replied. "I can't wait to see you." The call ended, and I turned to Ethan, my panic evident. "He's coming home," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to make sure he doesn't suspect anything." Ethan's expression darkened. "So that's it? We just pretend nothing happened?" "Yes," I said firmly. "It's the only way." The hours that followed were a blur of frantic cleaning and forced normalcy. I tried to keep my distance from Ethan, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark threatening to ignite a fire we couldn't control. When my husband finally arrived, he greeted me with a warm smile and an embrace that nearly broke me. I clung to him, my guilt threatening to spill over, but I held it back, determined to keep the truth buried. Ethan's demeanor shifted in my husband's presence, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet intensity. He avoided my gaze, but I could feel the weight of his unspoken words every time he was near. As the evening wore on, my husband suggested we all have dinner together. I agreed, forcing a smile as I prepared the table. But as we sat down, the tension in the room became unbearable. Every glance between Ethan and me felt like a betrayal, and I was certain my husband would notice. And then it happened. My husband excused himself to take a call, leaving Ethan and me alone in the dining room. He leaned across the table, his voice low. "How long do you think you can keep this up?" I froze, my fork clattering against my plate. "Ethan, don't." "Don't what?" he interrupted, his eyes blazing. "Pretend like nothing happened? Pretend like I don't know how you feel." "Keep your voice down," I hissed, panic rising. "He's just in the other room." Ethan leaned back, his expression defiant. "You can't hide from this forever, Aisha. Sooner or later, the truth will come out." Before I could respond, my husband returned, his smile as warm as ever. But I could feel the cracks in my carefully constructed facade widening, threatening to expose the truth I had worked so hard to conceal. As the night came to an end, I lay awake in bed, my husband's steady breathing beside me. I knew the peace I was clinging to was temporary. The choices I had made were like a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before everything I had built came crashing down. The days following my husband's return were a delicate balancing act of guilt, secrecy, and growing tension. I felt like I was living in a house of mirrors, where every interaction reflected my inner turmoil. My husband's smiles, his touch, his love, they all felt like daggers, reminders of how deeply I had betrayed him. And then there was Ethan, who had become both my greatest temptation and my most dangerous secret. He wasn't making it any easier. Ethan seemed emboldened, his behavior bordering on reckless. He'd find excuses to be near me, his presence a constant reminder of the night we had crossed the line. I tried to keep my distance, but he didn't make it easy. Every accidental brush of his hand, every lingering glance, felt like a silent challenge. One evening, my husband suggested a family dinner to celebrate his return. I agreed, masking my dread with a forced smile. As we sat around the table, the conversation flowed easily, but the tension beneath it was suffocating. I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, could sense the unspoken words he was holding back. I focused on my husband, laughing at his stories, trying to act like everything was normal. But the weight of the secret I was carrying made it almost impossible to breathe. And then the unthinkable happened. My husband had stepped away to answer a call, leaving Ethan and me alone in the room. The moment the door closed, Ethan leaned in, his voice low but firm. "How long do you think you can keep pretending?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. I stiffened, my fork trembling in my hand. "Ethan, stop this." "Not here." "Why not?" he challenged, a hint of defiance in his tone. "It's not like you can erase what happened. You felt it too, Aisha. Don't deny it." My heart pounded in my chest. "Ethan, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We can't do this. He's right there." Before he could respond, my husband walked back into the room, his cheerful demeanor unchanged. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he had noticed something. His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of my actions pressed down on me, suffocating me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every choice that had led me to this point. I had risked everything, my marriage, my family, my honor, for a fleeting moment of passion. And now it was all unraveling. The breaking point came the next day. My husband had left for work, and I was alone in the house with Ethan. I tried to stay busy, cleaning and organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. But Ethan found me in the kitchen, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "There's nothing to talk about. It's over, Ethan. It has to be." He stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen. You can't pretend you don't feel something." I turned to face him, my hands trembling. "What I feel doesn't matter. What we did was wrong, Ethan. I made a mistake, and I have to live with it. But it can't happen again." He looked at me, his expression a mix of hurt and frustration. "You're lying to yourself, Aisha. You're trying to convince yourself that you don't want this, but I see it in your eyes." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "It doesn't matter what I want," I cried, my voice breaking. "I can't destroy my family. I can't hurt him like that." Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. "But what about us?" he whispered. "What about what we feel?" I stepped back, shaking my head. "There is no us, Ethan. There can't be. I'm your father's wife. This has to stop." The finality of my words seemed to sink in, and for a moment, Ethan looked as though he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "You never had me," I replied, my voice trembling. "Not in the way you think." The days that followed were a painful blur of avoidance and strained interactions. I tried to focus on rebuilding my relationship with my husband, throwing myself into the routine of our lives. But the guilt was always there, a constant shadow that I couldn't escape. Ethan kept his distance, though I could feel his presence like a weight in the air. He was still there, still a part of my life, but the connection we had shared was gone. And as much as it hurt, I knew it was for the best. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I felt the full weight of my actions. I had made a choice that had nearly destroyed everything I held dear. But I also knew that I had the power to make things right, to rebuild what I had broken. The days turned into weeks, and the dust began to settle. My husband remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had raged beneath our roof, and I clung to the fragile peace we had managed to restore. Ethan, too, had withdrawn, keeping his distance and avoiding any unnecessary interactions. Though his presence in the house was a constant reminder of my guilt, the silence between us became a small mercy. I threw myself into my marriage, determined to rebuild the bond one had almost destroyed. I planned small surprises for my husband, cooked his favorite meals, and even accompanied him on business trips when I could. I was trying desperately to mend the cracks in our relationship. But every laugh, every moment of joy was tinged with an undercurrent of guilt. I couldn't look him in the eyes without remembering how I had betrayed him. Ethan, for his part, seemed to be moving on, or at least pretending to. He spent more time out of the house, filling his days with activities and friends. But whenever our paths crossed, I could see it in his eyes, the lingering pain, the unspoken words. It was a wound we both carried, though we never spoke of it again. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my thoughts drifted back to the choices I had made. How had I allowed myself to fall so far? How had I risked everything for a moment of passion, a fleeting sense of excitement? The answers didn't come easily. All I knew was that I had hurt the people I loved most, and I would carry that burden for the rest of my life. I decided to take a step toward healing. That night, I sat down with my husband and told him about the distance I had felt in our marriage, the emotional void that had left me vulnerable to temptation. I didn't tell him the whole truth, I couldn't. But I opened up about my struggles, my insecurities, and my desire to rebuild what we had lost. To my surprise, he listened. He didn't judge or accuse. Instead, he took my hand and promised that we would work through it together. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. In the quiet of my own heart, I also made a promise to never allow myself to fall into that darkness again. The line I had crossed could never be undone, but I could ensure it was never crossed again. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn from it, grow from it, and become a better person. I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Temptation is powerful, but so is the ability to choose what's right. Love, trust, and commitment are fragile, and it takes constant effort to nurture them. And guilt, as heavy as it is, can be a guide, a reminder of where we went wrong and a motivation to do better. I also realized that forgiveness, true forgiveness, had to start with myself. I had to let go of the shame and self-loathing that had consumed me. Only then could I move forward, not as the woman I had been, but as the woman I wanted to become. Ethan eventually moved out, starting a life of his own far from the memories we had created together. I hoped he would find happiness, that he would heal in his own way. As for me, I stayed by my husband's side, working every day to rebuild the trust one had shattered. In the end, the experience changed me. It was a painful reminder of how fragile life is, how easily it can be broken. But it also taught me about resilience, about the power of honesty, and about the strength it takes to rebuild what's been lost. If you've ever faced a moment of temptation, I hope my story reminds you of the consequences. Life is precious, and the choices we make can have ripple effects far beyond what we imagine. Guard your heart, cherish your relationships, and remember that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance to start again. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Could you have resisted, or would the temptation have taken over? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. The next tale is even more shocking. You won't believe what happened when a forbidden secret tore a family apart. Stay tuned.